So, David, hello. Good morning for you. I'm very glad to participate in this dialogue with you, and I want to introduce my old colleague and friend, Professor David Kotz, University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and I'm Alexander Buzgalin, Professor of Moscow State University, and we have today discussion devoted to the problems of uprising, revolt, I don't know what name we can use, David will explain us, which took place in many cities, towns of the United States. And now this is, I think, event not only of the United States, this is event of the whole world. And even in Russia, we had debates on one of the most important talk shows in our central TV, Вечер Соловьев, Evening with Solovyov. And one of the leading liberals of our country said the host of communism is moving in the United States. So something like that. It was joke, of course, but joke very symbolic. Never before we can hear something like that. And we received a lot of requests from our viewers, from our listeners. I'm talking about our YouTube channel Alternatives to explain what is happening, what are the reasons, what are the contradictions. And David agreed. Thank you very much, David, for participation in this dialogue. So we will start from introduction. We asked David to speak around 20 minutes, plus minus 5 minutes. Then some comments from Alexander. Then quick, or maybe not very quick, it's up to you, David, responses to my comments and questions. And second part of our dialogue will be dialogue with Boris Kagarlitsky, but about this little later. So, David, you have floor, and we are very glad to hear you.
Well, I'm glad to be here virtually rather than physically. Is the audio okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, it's okay. Yes, we can hear you.
Well, in the US, there have been massive protests in a huge number of locations around the country, including places that have not seen this kind of protest previously. All of them around the symbol Black Lives Matter, a slogan and a movement that has been around for a few years, but suddenly took off and became a real mass protest movement. A striking fact about these protests is that a majority of the protesters are white people.
Really? I'm sorry for interruption, but this is very unexpected. In Russia, we have only dialogues about black who are protesting and white who are in opposite side of barricades. I'm sorry, it's my emotion.
Until this protest took off, the Black Lives Matter protests, which had occurred periodically, have been largely or entirely African American people. But this time, the majority of the participants are white in the country as a whole. And the size is remarkable. I live in a small city of 30,000 people, Northampton, Massachusetts. Last Saturday, there was a protest, a Black Lives Matter protest. 4,500 people showed up, which is more than 10% of the population.
Fantastic.
It was quite remarkable. These protests have put serious pressure on the established structures of power to respond in some way. And there have been proposals by mainstream officials in various places for serious reforms. This has happened in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where one of the killings had happened, where a large majority of the city council has put forward a measure that would replace the existing police force by something entirely new. Even in New York State, where the governor is very centrist Democrat, he is proposing significant reforms. So that's what's been happening. Now, some questions about it. What are the politics, the sort of overt demands of these protests? Well, this has two sides. First of all, anti-racism, and specifically targeting what everyone is now calling structural racism. That is, ways in which not just individual attitudes, but the way the institutions and structures in American society operate have perpetuated unequal treatment for African Americans and also other people of color. Secondly, specifically focused on the police and on police brutality and a demand that the police be transformed into something that would actually protect people in their communities rather than oppress them and assault them. It was interesting that one of the big events that was captured on the cell phone video was an assault on an older white protester who was pushed over and got a skull fracture and ended up in the hospital. He was trying to talk to a policeman. So the fact that the assault on this white protester, fit right into the sequence of events does suggest that it is not just about racism, but police brutality that has various dimensions is part of it. Now, why is this happening now? Well, there have been killings of black men before that have gone viral on the internet, but this time there were several graphic videos in quick succession in different places in the country. And they sort of built, and that had an impact. Then I think it is undeniable that the fact that millions of people had been sheltering at home, frustrated that they couldn't get out and do anything, so those who were sympathetic to the protests seized on this as an opportunity to make a public statement. My wife and I felt this ourselves. We thought, oh, we can finally go out. And we put on our masks and we joined the local demonstration with social distancing. So I think that was a factor that contributed to the size of these protests, because the many people who were more or less sympathetic were a lot more likely to go join a protest, given their psychological state. And then another factor is the frustration of millions of people who had supported the Democratic Party presidential candidacies of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who both had been calling for a major progressive change in American society. First Warren dropped out, and then Sanders was defeated by a centrist Democrat, and there were millions of particularly young people who were frustrated by this, and these protests provided an opportunity to act that many took advantage of. Now, why are so many of the protesters white in this case? I think there are two main factors. One is that younger white Americans are noticeably less racist than previous generations. There have been many public opinion surveys, interview studies that show that young people in the range of, say, 16 to 24 have much more progressive attitudes about race than has been the case in the US before, as well as progressive attitudes on other matters. In addition, there has been a major radicalization of young people going on in the US, really since 2015 or 2016, which was reflected in the candidacy of Senator Bernie Sanders in 2016, candidacy for the president, proclaiming that he was a socialist. And the term socialism has, in recent times, public opinion surveys show that a majority of young people, age 18 to 29 have a positive view of whatever they think socialism is, and a negative view of capitalism.
Fantastic, David.
So there is this widespread radicalization of young people. Tens of millions of people across the country now have an anti-capitalist view, and I think this results from the form of capitalism in recent times, which has been increasingly oppressive to young people. They don't face good job prospects. There are very few well-paying, stable jobs available. Housing costs have skyrocketed. Education burdens young people. Higher education burdens young people with huge debt. Healthcare is unaffordable. All of these things have pushed young people to think about why all these different problems are happening at once, which leads them to capitalism. At the same time, these young people do see racism as a problem, and they see it as one more oppressive aspect of capitalism. And so we're quite ready to join protests focused on racism. I think a comparison to the last major wave of protests and upheaval in the US and in the world in the 1960s, lasting through the early 70s, there are some similarities. In the late 60s in the US, large numbers of radicalized white college students joined anti-racism protests. While most of the protests were against the US imperialist war in Vietnam, some of the most militant student protests in that period, when the protest movement was centered around college students, the most militant ones were often against racism. There were fights demanding an African American Studies department at universities. One of the most militant student upheavals of that period occurred in Columbia University, where the students occupied administration buildings, and the protest centered around the university's plans to expand into a black neighborhood and causing problems for local black people. So
I'm sorry, that small interruption and explanation for Russian people. Columbia University is in the New York, and around are black regions, but Columbia University is very prestigious and elite university, if I'm not mistaken, yes?
You're not mistaken.
Okay, so sorry, it's to explain to Russians. Yes, please continue.
When I'm physically in Russia, I'm more attuned to these matters. Okay.
Yes.
Keep in mind, I'm really speaking to folks in Russia. Then there's the question of why this has been so effective. So far, it's been more effective than the protests of the late 60s, which met quite determined resistance from the structures of power. It took many years before the protests began to have an effect on policy. And I think first is the size and determination of the protesters. I think I've seen the effect of this on relatively mainstream political commentators who write in the major media. And a number of them seem to be kind of swept along by the mood of these massive protests. Then there's the fact that racism has no legitimacy in the US today. There is almost consensus, maybe 85% of the population believes that racism is evil and should not be allowed to exist. Then one more factor, and that is that Donald Trump is president, and his overt racism has been very evident in his presidency. When he referred to African nations using a foul language to characterize them as being like toilets. He's been overtly racist, and that prods mainstream Democratic politicians to the left on the issue on that issue. You know, it's so they see the protests as a way to weaken Trump, and they're more likely to be sympathetic to them. There's a similarity when the to the 60s, when the anti-Vietnam War protest movement began in 1963-64, the president was a Democrat, first Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson, and the Congress was controlled by Democrats. And that meant that many Democratic politicians condemned the protests. But once Richard Nixon was elected president as a Republican, who took office in 1969, then the Democratic politicians started to attack the U.S. war in Vietnam. So there's something similar going on here. So as always, there are many factors that are involved in the experience that we're seeing. In my view, it's too soon to say what the effect will be of these protests. Perhaps it will increase the likelihood that Donald Trump is reelected. Perhaps it will lead to significant structural reforms, but it's too early to tell. There is resistance to major structural reform around this issue, and we'll have to see and act.
Thank you very much, David. But there is one more question which we, I think, must discuss. It's the role of the left, political organizations, role of social movements, NGOs in these protest actions. Did they participate? Are they participating? Is it reality, or they are behind, I don't know, behind or outside, or just ordinary members participate? Do you have any comments on this question?
Well, the existing left organizations are participating, but they have not played a leading role in these protests. The protests seem to be very spontaneous. For example, in my community, this very large, for our locale, protest was initiated by one person. A Black transgender woman issued a call for people to protest at our local police station, and 4,500 people showed up. You know, because of it's possible to do this because of the internet and the social media. But I mean, I'm a member of the largest left organization in the U.S., Democratic Socialists of America, which now has about 70,000 members. It went from about 6,000 a couple of years ago to 70,000 today. Still a small fraction of the people who say they favor socialism in America. And the DSA chapters have been actively participating, organizing people to show up at city council meetings to demand changes. So the left organizations have been active, but they have not really been leading the protest movements. And one thing that consciously left activists have to face in this situation, very much like the left activists who were involved in the 1960s civil rights movement, was to avoid seeming like we were trying to take control from Black leaders, and to find ways to raise the broader issues of the problems of capitalism and the need for major social change, while respecting that the main demand of these protests is around racism and police brutality.
We have in Russia a lot of comments interconnected with brutality of protesters. That they destroy everything, they are taking from shops goods, they're simply robbers, and they're not protesters, they're aggressive hooligans, something like that. It's not even myth, it's reproduced from every corner all minute. Can you comment this? It's very important for Russians.
Well, this is typical. Whenever there's a protest movement, the powers that be try to attack it on the ideological plane by saying that it's just anarchists and violent people who are destroying property and threatening the safety of ordinary people. Uh, this happened in the 1960s. Those kind of claims. Uh, this always happens. Now, the basis for those claims is that there has been some looting that has occurred in some of the protests. Not all, not even most of them, but in some of them, there has been some looting going on. And it seems to be carried out by people who are not really connected with the protests, but who see a temporary breakdown in police control of the city to grab some things. It looks to be mainly poor people who are very angry, and so they break shop windows and take things. Unfortunately, it's been often locally owned, black-owned businesses that have been looted. President Trump has focused on that and has suggested that it's organized anarchists who are doing this. There are some anarchists around who believe in not really in looting, but they favor fighting the police and fighting right wingers. But it's not. Haven't seen any evidence of them playing an active role. The problematic behaviors seem to be coming from people not really part of the protests, who are just opportunistically grabbing some resources.
Maybe two more questions which are important for Russians, I think are important for Russians. So one is interconnected with the US Senate and US members of parliament. If you do have any big voices, or I don't know, a few voices in support of these protesters in both chambers of parliament or in any chamber of parliament, or nothing? And what about mainstream media? It's neutral comments, trying to be objective, or it's mainly only robots are coming to the streets, or sometimes positive for estimation. What is your vision of this situation?
Okay, well, as far as elected officials, a number of the black senators have praised the protests, although it's complex. The senator from California, I'm blocking her name, Harris. Senator Harris from California, who ran for the Democratic presidential nomination, she has supported said positive things about the protests, but she had been a prosecuting attorney earlier in her career and was a tough prosecutor. So she's been criticized for her record of prosecuting disproportionately black people in California. The one strong voice has been Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is a socialist member of the House of Representatives from New York City, who has been in the mass media a lot, and she has been quite articulate in supporting the protests. But the main voices have not come from the Senate. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have said positive things also, but they haven't really been prominently in the news around this issue. The media, the mainstream media's response. I mean, I don't read all of them, watch all of the mainstream media, but what I have watched, the New York Times in particular, has been on the whole sympathetic to the protests. Mm-hmm. It has been pretty objective. The reporting has pointed out that the looting has not been carried out by people who seem to be part of the protests. This is quite different from the early reporting on the anti-Vietnam War protests, mm-hmm. which were highly critical.
Yeah,
So
I just wanted to say this because I remember from your explanations that it was, I don't know how to say in English, absolutely total anti-movement comments in all mass media in 1960s.
well, this is different. The mass media has been objective, and being objective, it comes across sympathetic.
It's very unlikely with Russia. Russia, it's opposite situation. It's really strange.
Well,
We are becoming more
in,
right
in,
than United States in some aspects. It's,
yeah, well, in the U.S. system, uh, the the ruling class does not strictly control the mass media in a direct way. It's indirect. And when the ruling class is united about policy, such as in the early years of the Vietnam War, the major media were very critical of the anti-war movement. But eventually, a split developed, and significant members of big business and of the political elite began to turn against the war. And that gave the journalists in the Washington Post and the New York Times the space to begin reporting objectively. And toward the later part of the Vietnam War period, the major media were critical. So I think this has been accelerated this time. It's interesting that here's a relevant event that happened. When Trump took office, he took office without significant support from the traditional big business leadership in the U.S. He had support from some hedge fund managers and some oil companies, but it was very limited. Most of big business didn't like Trump's promise to impose tariffs, to cut immigration. They depend on immigrant workers and so forth. And the big corporations in the U.S. have racially integrated workforces, and even their management. Some top managers in big corporations in the U.S. are people of color or female, and Trump was expressing hostility to both. So Trump set up these big business councils to try to give him links to big business, since you can't really, in the end, rule effectively as president unless you have support from big business in normal times.
yeah.
So we set up these business councils with CEOs from a cross-section of American big corporations. And then, let's see, I think it was the summer of 2017, if I remember correctly, when the Charlottesville protest occurred, and white supremacists attacked the protesters, and one protester was killed by a white supremacist. And Trump said there are fine people among those counter-protesters. That was the issue that led the CEOs of this cross-section of big corporations to decide to disband the business councils. So it was not the tariffs. They were unhappy with the tariffs, but they were living with them. It was not the immigration rules. It was the overt racism of the of President Trump that drove them into opposition. So that shows that there is, to some degree, anti-racist views even in the mainstream of the American capitalist class.
Okay, thank you very much, David. I will also make some comments and suggestions, and then you react. And final word will be word of David Kotz. Okay.
Okay.
So, first of all, in Russia, we like very much to make theoretical conclusions on the basis of a few facts. It's our tradition. So, of course, I don't have enough information, but I had the first hypothesis, let's say, about this movement. I'm trying to understand what is happening during these 2 months, even more now. So first of all, I think that there are different levels of understanding of these events. And first level, which is appearance and which is very simple to explain and to find a lot of facts to prove this idea. First level is something like Luddism of 21st century.
The what?
Luddism, there was a movement in the beginning.
Oh, the Luddites.
Luddism.
The Luddites. Okay.
I'm sorry, Luddist. And it was movement against machines, not against capital. And here we have something similar according to the appearance. But this is appearance. A second aspect of this first level of appearance is interconnected with my maybe personal vision of situation in the US. Of course, I'm not US citizens, but I'm nearly every year in the United States from 1989 or 1990, I don't remember exactly when you first time invited me to the United States with lectures. And I was working a lot in New York area, and I was traveling in many cities in the West mainly, but in the East and so on. And I saw more and more poor life in some regions of big cities. Especially it was visible in New York. And last time when I was in Left Forum 2 years ago, it was like tragedy when I was moving along these regions. I was working in not the most poor region. It was in the east. It's Bronx. It's Bronx. Yeah.
East Bronx.
Yeah, and it was an extremely poor region with people who were, I think, starving, and it was appearance of people who don't know what to do, what is the goal of their life. They were empty eyes, if I can say in English.
You would say vacant eyes.
Yeah, vacant eyes. So, and it was big psychological impression for me. Not, of course, systematization of facts for scholar, but just like artistic impression. And finally, I had the feeling, not hypothesis, but feeling, that there is growth of real degradation of some part of US society. It was similar in Russia in 1990s. In some part of Russia, it was degradation, and people were ready for very brutal and protest without any exact goals, without any exact even attempts to build something, just to say no. Because life is bad, no culture, no education, no positive experience, no self-organization, and attempt to make something destructive. I know that there are a lot of different NGOs, organizations among poor US citizens and different peoples of color, Afro-Americans. I met a lot of these militants in Left Forum and social forums and so on. But I saw also a lot of people who are very far from this. It's like in Russia, we have social militants, we have activists, and we have a lot of ordinary people who has no connection. It's like oil and water, or I don't know even how to explain this. So this was just feelings and impressions. Then official statistic, which you know much better than me, that there is growth of social polarization and growth of corporate power. I can say growth of totalitarian power of market in all spheres. And this consumerization, this marketization of life moved to the education, to culture, to family life, to all spheres of existence. And finally created choice, either rich life where you can consume a lot, or nothing and only violence. We had similar situation in late years of Soviet Union, not late decades of the Soviet Union, let's say 70s, early 80s, when we had the attempt to build consumer society in the economy of shortage. It was terrible contradiction, especially for conformist people, for, let's say, ordinary person for whom socialist ideology, communist values means nothing. He wants to buy and to have prestige commodities and prestige consumption. But there is nothing in the shops. In the US, I saw a similar picture. People want to buy, people want to have prestige life, but they don't have money to buy even very simple things. Shops in poor regions are like shops in Soviet Union, not empty shelves, but nothing really good. When I bought some food, it was like synthetic. I was eating bread, and it was like that after 3 weeks in the shelf. Yeah, it was not bread, but I don't know what. So maybe it's over-exaggeration, I don't know. But it was second, I think, level of social economic contradictions, which led to the global contradictions, which did not create at the same time social force to solve these contradictions. Also, there are a lot of talks, even in Russia, I think in the United States, in English-speaking world, about precariat, about new, maybe future class or proto-class of people who are living without stable jobs, without social protection, without trade unions, without social and political self-identification, without ideological self-identification. Some one, I don't know, months, 1 year, they have good job, like freelancer, then he must take pizza and run by in bicycle or motorbike to sell this pizza, to deliver this pizza. And I even know some of my young friends who were students who made first steps in their freelance activity, but then after some maybe months, sometimes 2-3 years of good life, they lost everything. And then they were jobless or working as very, how to say, unskilled workers with good high education. I don't know about US, do you have the same problems or not, but also this problem of debts, with education debts, students' credits. And all this created very deep social economic contradictions, which is which is possible to reflect even on statistical level, but finally didn't create new social force which can solve this contradiction. Because when we had in late 90s, early 20s, late end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century, we had the growth of contradictions, imperialist contradictions, capitalist contradictions, but it was at the same time growth of industrial proletariat, organized proletariat, big working class, growth of education of this working class. It was collective work of these people, main force of Russian Revolution in 1917. Specialists, skilled workers in machinery, in steel industry, and so on. Plus, let's say, poor intelligentsia. Also wage labor, but mental labor. We had also some hopes, we theoreticians, had some hopes that we have new social strata which can be very important force for new protest activity. People who are, let's say, ordinary representatives of creative class, teachers, doctors, in general, healthcare workers, social workers, ordinary specialists in art, not elite painters or elite, I don't know, singers, stars, so-called, and so on. People who has, I don't know, some $1,000 in the United States, maybe from 2 to 5, people who has middle wage in Russia, which is poverty in the United States, but in Russia it's so-so. And these people are socialized, they are smart, they're educated. But the problem is that in our country, they are mainly in state sector. And from abstract point of view, they're like socialists. They're receiving money from social budget. They're producing social values. And they're working in social sector. But they're under the pressure of bureaucratic bourgeois state. And because of that, they're semi-slaves of this state. They're not wage labor in capitalist private sphere, but they're semi-slaves of bourgeois bureaucratic state. I don't know about United States, but majority of people who were active in social forums, world social forums, so I don't know, 20, 50,000 people from different NGOs. Left forum in the United States, how much? Many thousand people also. Not only in New York, in the West Coast also. It was these ordinary representatives of social workers, teachers, students, professors. So rank and file intelligentsia, according to Russian slang. We had hopes that this strata can be organizing force, like a proletariat in the movement of early 20th century. And in some aspects, it's true. When we saw protests against Iraq war, when we saw protests against some laws in France, in education and so on. In the United States, it's Occupy Wall Street. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's my opinion. Now, protest is absolutely another. And except your town, and this is absolutely great, 4,500 people in Amherst. It's, no, not in Amherst, in your town. It's absolutely fantastic. But I don't know if these people really are trying to participate and to play active role of maybe not of leaders, not of vanguard, but role of organizers, of those who are working hard to put people together for some positive requirements. So this is main maybe problem and main question. This was third level of explanation and maybe questioning, putting questions about is there or there is no social force which can be organizational driving motor for the positive, constructive actions, not only for the protest actions on the basis of this protest movement. So that's my comments.
You raised some very interesting questions.
I was trying to make my best in 10 minutes.
So let me just say something about class analysis. Of course, Marxism introduced the idea that progress would come not from intellectuals with new ideas that would convince the rulers that we needed change, but from the struggles of the victims, the main victims of capitalism, the proletariat, the working class, the wage workers. If you actually look at the history of large socialist movements and seizures of power, it has not always happened exactly that way. I think the Russian Revolution partially involved that. As you say, the urban proletariat played a leading role in the Russian Revolution, but so too did the effects of World War I, and which is the link between capitalism and war. And so too did angry peasants who were rebelling against a somewhat different set of oppressive conditions in the countryside. In the Chinese...
Yes, sorry, I will interrupt for 1 minute. It's a parallel which I wanted to present, but did not present in good way. So the idea was, it was a protest from below in 1917 because of the World War I, from peasants, from poor people, protest which came to the streets in February. We want bread and nothing else. Yeah, we are hungry.
Bread, peace, and land, right?
Yeah, peace, bread, peace, land, yes. But then was force which said, yes, guys, you are right. And well, first of all, it was not guys, it was women who came to the streets, by the way.
That's right.
Yeah, in February.
And then the Russian Social Democratic Party, the Bolshevik wing, was able to organize it.
Okay. Yeah, and this proletariat and ordinary intelligentsia became people who were not the leaders even, they were inside, what is important. They were not on the top and say, so follow me, I am leader, I will explain everything, you must elect me. Yeah, they were inside and helping people to do this. One important comment, when Soviets took power in November 1917, it was power of Soviets. It was not power of Bolsheviks. And in many
Right.
Soviet
Yeah,
regions, the
yeah,
Bolsheviks
I
didn't
know.
have majority. It was people who supported Bolsheviks, but they were not Bolsheviks. Sorry.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
I like your
But
point.
the following revolutions were somewhat different. The Chinese Revolution, I think an honest reading of that, the industrial working class, very small in China, did not play an important role. The mass base was the peasants for the Chinese Revolution, but there was a Communist Party that was able to lead, and the contradiction with Japanese imperialism played a key role in the events that enabled the Communist Party to take power. Then in Cuba, it was an anti-dictatorship movement that overthrew a repressive dictator. And the US didn't intervene, not understanding how radical the leadership was of that revolution. So there are these two questions. What is the mass base that can lead to the overthrow of an oppressive order and its replacement by socialism? And then what kind of organization must be present for that to happen? I think you were raising both of those. Now, you described the very oppressive conditions in the US. You were really describing the trend in US capitalism since 1980. That is the neoliberal era. In the preceding decades, the degree of inequality had gradually declined. For 25 years after World War II, the average wage rose every year. Most of the working class had relatively stable, permanent, if you will, jobs. And that all reversed after 1980. And so for what you observed in US cities, the increasing poverty, this was part of the effects of the neoliberal form of capitalism. And it has just kept accelerating. The big crisis of 2008 made it worse, and it has continued the same retrograde trends of increasing inequality, a few billionaires and more poor people. The people who thought they were middle class finding they're sinking. Their children realize they won't be able to attain the same level of material comfort that their parents had. This has been ongoing in US society. Now, I don't think it's reached the level of degradation as you described it. I mean, Marx identified the reserve army of labor as the most oppressed part of the working class, those who did not have regular jobs. In the Marxist tradition, there was a concept of the lumpen proletariat, which is the part of the proletariat that never has regular jobs and that can sometimes be a reactionary force. In the late 60s, some groups thought the lumpen proletariat could play an active role, but you saw it in the urban uprisings when there was just mass-based burning and looting that occurred. I mean, that has not happened this time. The protests at this time in the U.S. Are primarily young people, middle-aged people. They are from a variety of class positions. Many of them are, they're mostly wage earners, salary earners of some kind. And the young people, many of them have temporary jobs. But I think it's possible that out of this stew can come the base for a significant radical movement. There has been an increase in strikes in the US in the last year. For the first time since the beginning of the neoliberal era, there's an uptick in strikes. Actually, there was a small uptick in the 90s, but this is happening again. As you noted, the groups that have been most prominent in engaging in labor action and in taking a whole raft of politically progressive positions have been workers in the public sector and the nonprofit sector. Teachers, nurses, a variety of public employees. Nurses often work in private nonprofits, hospitals. So it has not been directly a struggle against capital in the in the strict sense, but it has led to an anti-capitalist consciousness among many of those groups. In my view, the missing element is a political organization that can develop strategy and lead this movement. I think in the US, the Democratic Socialists of America is the most promising candidate for that. It used to be a sleepy social democratic organization and has this huge infusion of radicalized young people. It's unrecognizable compared to what it had been 5 years ago. It's got all kinds of left politics in it, and it operates democratically internally. I'm hopeful that DSA can, as the acronym DSA in English, for Democratic Socialists of America, that it can become a leading force in the variety of protests that are going on. You know, the anti-racism protests are the big ones, but there have also been growing protests around the cost of housing, against evictions, tenants unions, unions of occupants of apartment buildings have been forming. There have been a whole variety of different kinds of organization occurring that DSA and other left organizations have participated in, and in some cases initiated. Protests of students against the cost of public higher education, and so forth. So I think it is not an uprising of the lumpen at this time. I think the looting has been a minor phenomenon as a reflection of the very thing you described, of the degradation of some people, that, you know, they never have a chance at a decent life in any way but by just seizing things when they see the opportunity. But the main force of these protests has been from a more intermediate classes, service workers, industrial workers. You know, there have been informal strikes of workers in the meatpacking industry, which is mostly Black and Hispanic, heavily female, and they're being forced to work under very dangerous conditions. And they've been having informal strikes demanding that their workplace be safe. So I think there is promise in this in the years ahead. This may develop into a serious mass-based socialist movement in the U.S.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much for everybody who was with us. I want to make a small conclusion. So first of all, you have to read the books and articles of David Kotz. We have a lot of publications of David in our journal Alternatives, so you are welcome to read them. And we have a lot of Russian texts of David in Russian internet. And we have hope that one time your Harvard University Press will allow us to publish your book about neoliberal capitalism. So in Russian, it will be very important for us if it is.
Oh, we should talk about that.
So, but this we can discuss later. It's just advice to everybody. It's important to read books of David and articles of David. Thank you very much, David. And so tomorrow David has a birthday. So if you will see this after June 19th, you can send greetings and congratulations to Professor David Kotz. Goodbye, David. Greetings.
Okay, thank you, Sasha. Goodbye.
Goodbye.